Hi everyone. I've been in risk for 14 years, and I started my kind of career in Australia, which was convenient because it turned out Australian School of Thought won and became the kind of the global benchmark. I was the first ever graduate intake in risk management, which again was fun because the university, I studied at one of the biggest universities in Australia, the university cancelled that course because they didn't feel risk management was a profession. Which is funny because I'm a risk management professional from the very beginning. Luckily, I have a second degree in statistics. Otherwise, I probably would have been would have been stuffed. But anyway, I worked in consulting a lot. I spent most of my kind of professional risk career in Australia, and then I thought, what's the opposite of Australia? So I moved to Moscow and worked there for 5 years, and I was the head of risk of one of the sovereign. I was the head of risk of 2 of the sovereign funds in the country. But because I'm a good risk manager in life, it's now been 3 years since I sold all my assets in Russia and moved out my family completely, and we live in Spain. Because you have to manage your personal risks as well as corporate risks. So now I have a lot of free time, and that's why I do a lot of very controversial videos, and I publish hundreds of articles and books, and everything is free. And there's on Risk Academy, if you Google Risk Academy, you'll find a lot of unusual and different points of view on risk management. Now, if a couple of years ago most people considered me crazy, now it's pretty much fair to say that there's a lot of other publications that kind of confirm or move in a similar direction to what I'm saying. And we wanted fun, yeah? So I've done slides which are the ultimate fun. So I wanted to, before I give you like the 10th step on how you actually integrate risk management into strategic planning, which is, by the way, quite difficult and mathematical. But before I do that, I wanted just to very briefly, I mean, I only have like 40 minutes, but I wanted very briefly to give you some of the things to think about going forward. And the one thing I'm noticing globally in risk space, there's now that thinking or consensus, maybe not consensus yet, but there's a lot of outspoken people who are suggesting that maybe risk management or enterprise-wide risk management, maybe it's not a one thing, maybe there are 2 risk managements. And naively, for many years, I thought that if you do if you do just risk management good in general, then everybody will be satisfied. But the reality is the stakeholders want completely different things. And there's basically, I think that's the direction the world is taking. There's risk management 1 for the external world. That's what external auditors, internal auditors, state auditors, prosecution office, banks, insurance companies, credit rating agencies, and anybody else you can think of. That's what the external world wants to see. And there's the risk management 2, which is what the decision makers within the company want to see. And while it's not really, I mean, I've done this kind of matrix analogy. It's not really a matrix analogy. You can't really choose one or the other. But what you do have to make as risk professionals, what you do have to make a very conscious decision how much time you're going to allocate to one or the other. Because basically you can't really do well both things, it's just too time consuming. And what I have discovered is that majority of the people in the world are spending too much time on risk management 1, which is your kind of this facade, fashionable thing. To satisfy an internal auditor, it will probably take me 15 minutes to come up with the risk registers, heat maps, risk reports, framework, policy, risk appetite statements, and literally anything else you can think of. And in fact, I did that. I had an interesting story. I did that. I was brought into one of the sovereign funds because the Auditor General and the internal auditors and the prosecution office complained that it was a sovereign fund with government money, but there was no proper risk management in place. So that didn't really sit well. So I was brought in to fix something, create a set of documents and frameworks and everything else to satisfy, whatever these requirements were. So within 3 months, I've done anything you can think of: risk committee, policy framework, appetite statements, risk owners, mitigation plans, risk registers, reports, heat maps, the kind of the usual. And then something interesting happened. When I was presenting this to the CEO, he said, wonderful, but it doesn't really affect how I make, multi-million-dollar decisions every day. So that was the beginning of the journey when I started realizing that, it sounds like that none of this stuff has any relevance to the actual decision makers, which is weird because they pay our salaries. Yeah, so we don't really get paid by the audit committee or the external auditors or the credit rating agencies. And yet we're spending so much time on this artificial stuff when it should be taking minutes, but we're spending months preparing for our quarterly risk workshops. Your quarterly risk workshops have nothing to do with how people make decisions in the workplace. They make decisions every day, and that's, the scariest thing I usually hear executives say is that I've just signed a multi-million-dollar contract, where was your risk management? Which is kind of weird. Well, the risk manager was busy, preparing for the next quarterly risk workshop. So clearly, some things are just something's not right in our, in our little world of risk management. So I wanted to give you just some very brief examples between what is risk management 1 versus what is risk management 2, and then we can figure it out. So risk appetite, is everybody kind of familiar with that? Yeah. So the risk management 1, it's basically risk management for someone else. It's an artificial set of documents that it's not a lie, but it doesn't really have anything to do with the actual day-to-day management of an organization. So in risk management 1, you would have a risk appetite statement linked to your strategic objectives, but in risk management 2, you actually don't need a risk appetite statement at all. And there's a lot of reasons. There's a lot of reasons behind that. Mainly because all of existing policies and procedures that are approved at the board level already have all the limits and all the appetites and tolerances. You can call it whatever. All of those concepts are nonsense. But basically, if you just look at existing board level documents, what you would surprisingly discover is that most risk appetites have been documented for decades, and you don't really have to do anything else. Another kind of the next component, quite typical for an organization to have a risk management framework, would you say? A document which kind of your risk management procedure. Well, again, technically speaking, you don't need it. Not only that, ISO 31000 doesn't actually require you to have one. I think the only document, and Alex can kind of correct me on that, the only document even mentioned in ISO 31000 is just the risk management policy. There's nothing about having a procedure, because there's a better way. And for any of you, just a raise of hands, who has a risk management framework in their organization? Or procedure manual, or guideline, like they usually have different names. So what's the intention? Like who's supposedly reads these documents? Who are these documents designed for? By the way, this is not the most difficult question. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Management of the group.
Yeah, theoretically, yeah, yeah.
Because some parts you actually publish in the annual report.
Yeah, yeah, of course. I would guess in your framework it actually says this document is intended for everyone in the organization, which is again pretty straightforward. Who's actually reading those documents? Who do you think? Like, who are the two people who actually read this document? The risk manager who wrote it, and internal and external auditors, because they'll look at it once a year. So again, something's not right. Like, you design the document that is supposedly for everyone, but do you really have CFOs reading the framework? Do you have head of procurement going, I've just noticed something in your risk management framework. Can we discuss? So something's not right, and that's because risk management framework is your risk management 1 type thing. Unfortunately, you still have to have it because literally everyone asks for it. A bank, when they do an audit, a credit rating agency, an external auditor, they will all request it. And I had a lot of fun, and I obviously didn't care, because I had fights with our local regulators in Russia. I came to the regulator's office and I said, this is ridiculous, you're asking us all the wrong questions. And they hated me for it, but I don't expect everybody to have like a huge battle with your local regulatory community. So we always have that. We always keep that document, it sits somewhere on the shelf. I at some stage got really embarrassed because I haven't really updated it in 3 years, because I knew the document was not real. There was nothing in it that was real, it was all artificial, so I never cared. Because there's a better way. And the risk management too is, instead of having all your risk stuff in a single document which nobody reads, what we tried in the sovereign fund where I worked is we actually put all the key messages of risk into existing other policies and procedures, which again seems pretty straightforward. So in the procurement procedure, there would be an element before selecting a vendor, you have to analyze and consider risks, and here's like the template how you would do it. In the investment guidelines, we would say before making an investment decision, or when making an investment decision, you have to give proper consideration to risks, and here's the template, here's the methodology, how you would do it. Another kind of thing with risk management framework, which is completely artificial, is that it implies that you have a single risk management process and a single set of risk criteria, supposedly, for risk management, which of course is silly because I always had like 5 at least, because you would analyze and measure and determine which risks are important for an investment project differently, how you would do it for budgeting, how you would do it for strategic planning, how you would do it for procurement. So there are actually numerous risk management methodologies in any given organization. Auditors, obviously, external auditors, or I should say the banks and the insurance companies who ask for that information, they don't care. They just want to see a single document which is summarizing everything. But in fact, it's impossible. You have different criteria. Yes, please.
Challenging it, but does it have to be artificial in a sense? I mean, you're saying you have a risk management framework which is for auditors and explains all the risk processes.
Yeah.
I agree, most people don't read it. But if you're taking elements from that and putting it in other policies which are used, I mean, is it really artificial, or is it just that you're making sure that the framework is actually utilized?
Well, what you would discover when you do that, when you kind of try and spread the risk messages to all the existing policies and procedures, what you would discover is that none of the stuff written in your framework actually applies. You would actually write it very differently. Like there would be a different methodology for procurement, there would be a different methodology for budgeting and strategic planning. So once you try and do that, you will discover that it's pretty artificial and not very important. But unfortunately, we can't really get rid of it, so we have to kind of pretend that it's important. It would be nice if we just had to do risk management once and everybody was satisfied. But in reality, the two stakeholder groups, the management within the company and the external stakeholders outside, they want completely different things. I mean, they want such different things as that when we showed our proper risk modeling to the Ministry of Finance, they said, no, it's too complicated. Give us the heat map back. Like we want our green, red, and amber. But we said we did 10,000 scenarios, and we can show you when the cash flow liquidity gaps will be and how much money the company is going to lose. I said too much. So we have to pretend a little bit. So risk management 1 is doing your your quarterly or your risk updates, your risk register updates on whatever basis, usually linked to your your normal budgeting cycle. Again, nice, doesn't really help drive the actual decision making because the decisions first they're very different, but they also happen all the time. So one of the key takeaways from the updates of the ISO 31000 is that it's really pushing, even though it was always there. I mean, since we've been working with ISO 31000 from 2004, when it was first the Australian standard 4360, nothing really has changed fundamentally. But the messages that were in between the lines in the 2009 version, now they're blindly obvious. So there are 14 pages in the new standards, and I think 17 times the word integration is mentioned. So more than once in every page, it's literally in every single paragraph. So this integration actually, that has a huge implication because the modern day risk management approach is the opposite of integrated. Having a risk workshop and just getting many people involved, that's not integration. Integration is changing how decisions are made. In fact, there is a section, I can't remember what's the number of the section, but it's called implementing. So basically, this is the 4 steps that the ISO 31000 says how you should implement risk management. It says, identify how, when, and where the decisions are made within the organization, change the way decisions are made to make sure risk analysis is integrated into the actual decision-making process, and give people tools and techniques and teach them and make sure it all continues to work. So this is how you implement risk management. There's nothing about writing a policy or framework or doing risk assessments on a quarterly basis. The way you integrate risk management is you change how decisions are made within the company, and I'll show you an example on how you actually integrate it into strategic planning. And as I was saying, what you kind of discover is that decisions are very different in nature, in time frame, in data intensity, in complexity of tools. And one single consolidated risk management process or approach or methodology doesn't really work that well. So you end up usually having 5 or 6 or 7 different risk managements, which is, again, great because it was always implied in the 2009 version of ISO 31000, but now it's explicit. It actually says in the section process, it actually says there may or will be multiple instances of risk management process, which is kind of weird because I represented Russia on the update, and we've been pushing big time to not even call it a process, because it kind of implies that it's a standalone process, and in the diagram even it looks like a standalone process, which is literally the opposite of what it really is. And the other kind of risk management 1 versus risk management 2 comparison is that we are quite familiar with the kind of typical qualitative tools, the likelihood type, times consequences. By the way, quick question to all of you. What's better, likelihood multiplying by consequences or likelihood adding to consequences? Any other versions? Don't be shy. As I say, risk management is not for shy people. What's better? I'll tell you the answer in a second. Let me ask you another question. What's better, a 3x3 risk matrix or a 5x5 risk matrix? It actually doesn't depend.
I use 4x4.
Okay. Yeah? Okay, excellent. 4x4? Yeah. All right, so let me rephrase. What's better, 3x3, 4x4, or 5x5? Sorry, where did the answer?
It doesn't matter.
Of course, and I hope you will, by the end of my speech today, you will kind of understand that. Multiplying or adding likelihood and consequences doesn't matter because both methods are completely irrelevant, not mathematical, and a waste of time. 3x3, 4x4, 5x5 doesn't matter because qualitative risk assessments have nothing to do with reality. There's so much research to suggest that it's not just a waste of time, it's actually dangerous. Then, of course, there is other better ways. So, risk management 1, we still kind of play along with this, heat maps. By the way, if you are a risk manager, the best research you can read. By the way, one of the professors is Swedish, and the name of the research is called "The Risk of Using Risk Matrices." I think as a practicing risk manager, you must read this study. There's much more on that in the Douglas Hubert's book called "Why Risk Management is Broken and How to Fix It." And Douglas is writing a second version of his book now. So there is considerable amount of research to answer the question why you should never use heat maps. But basically, we can't really get rid of them because the regulators and the credit rating agencies still expect to see something. In fact, in some of the industries, people are so unlucky that, for example, in pharmaceuticals, it's a requirement to document risks in the form of a heat map. This just shows how ignorant the regulators are. And in Russia, for example, all our government-based corporations are forced to have heat maps. So we do that because the regulators ask us. But that has nothing to do with actual risk management, and I'll show you how to integrate risk management into strategic planning in a second. So again, next one, risk management 1. Most of you, I'm sure, have risk management reports. How often do you generate risk management reports? Okay, yeah. There's no right or wrong answer. It's just Nowhere does it say how often you should generate risk management reports, which is the beauty, by the way, of risk management. It's very difficult to audit because there's nowhere where it says how something should be done. And that's why auditors love COSO so much, because it has so many pages of text. And they hate ISO so much because it's so generic and high level that I, as a risk manager, can justify literally anything using it. But anyway, risk management 1, having risk reports, but there is a much better way, is of course integrating risk information into existing performance reports. So more mature organizations, they don't have risk reports. For example, I never had risk reports. We just take existing performance reports that CEOs and CFOs prepare, and we change how information is presented. So for example, we had a portfolio of 95 companies, and we always said we had 95 companies. Well, we started saying we have 95 companies, out of which 60 are considered high risk, and 30 are considered medium risk, or something like that. Or we said, this is our cash flow forecast for the next 3 years, and in year 2019, there's a probability of having a cash deficit, and this is how much with a 95% confidence interval that cash deficit may be. So the kind of risk management too is changing how performance is reported within the organization, rather than having a separate risk report. And now, I wanted to very quickly show you how you would integrate risk management into strategic planning. So just a quick question. Yes, go on. Please.
This is very much in line with the topic of integrated reporting. It's quite fashionable that you want to have, for instance, a lot of sustainability concerns
Yes.
put into the financial reports. And I expect you, as you want to also put into risk management.
And we did.
Yeah. Do you see any danger of stuffing too much stuff into the report that you actually are
Yeah.
obfuscating rather than
Yeah.
clarifying?
I'm yet to see an example where it was overdone. I have actually seen quite a few examples where board members said, we feel weird because you're presenting to us performance report and you're saying everything fine, and then the following day or the following week, risk managers is presenting their risk report and saying, but the risk level is significantly increasing. And they're saying, this is weird, like surely you can report it side by side, so we can say we're making more money, but we're also absorbing more risk. So I'm yet to see examples of overdoing it. I'm sure anything can be ruined by overdoing it, but I think we don't do it enough yet. We're at the stage where we're kind of just thinking. And by the way, I do a lot of research in cognitive biases, so I expect at least 30% of you in your mind, your mind is spinning, you're finding excuses why what I'm saying doesn't apply to your country or your company, or it's one of the most common one is it's too theoretical. Well, all of the things I've discussed has been done by a number of organizations, and they've been doing it for like 5-6 years. So none of this is new. This is how risk management works in more mature organizations. So strategic planning. And before we go into that, any kind of quick questions?
When you talk about your 3x3, 5x5 matrix,
Yes.
so you mean quantitative in the sense that just low, medium, high? Because we use a matrix, but it's quantitative. Those numbers represent amounts, probabilities.
Yeah, it's not real though. They represent categories of probabilities and numbers. All of this is artificial. It's not real. You don't actually do a proper quantification to determine which bucket it falls into. I presume, but we'll see.
The real problem that it's point estimation instead of understanding that there are multiple realities in the future.
Exactly, and this is how I'm going to describe you how you actually integrate risk management into strategic planning. Basically, life is complex and unpredictable. Any attempt of making single point estimates and basing your decisions on single point estimates is silly. For example, if I were to ask you, what is going to be the weather in Gothenburg next year, same day? What would you...
Probably the same.
Yeah. Raining. No, seriously, like how would you answer? Similar?
I don't think it matters. The question is if it's, what would be the impact to your business if it was raining versus...
This is not a business question. This is me asking you a general day-to-day life question. What's the weather going to be like in Gothenburg next week, same day?
I don't know. There's an 85% chance it'll rain.
Yeah. Okay. You don't know, probably the same. What else? If we were talking about degrees, like how many degrees do you think it will be? Would you seriously say that though? Because I'm trying to make a point is that when we talk about uncertainty in life, nobody is silly enough to actually make forecasts about unforeseeable long-term future and say single point estimates, yeah? Because you will say similar to now plus minus 5 degrees, like I think we're clever enough to realize that uncertainty has a huge impact. Yet this is the opposite of how business plans. Is this rain? Yeah. Thanks, Sarah. You ruined it for us. So anyway, you see, in life, we don't make just brush statements about the future, but in business we do. We say, we will make 100 million revenue next year, which of course is silly. That's not how life works. Unless you have a budget adjustment on the 31st of December, when you have 100%, you update your budget and you meet it 100% all the time, you're guaranteed to not have 100 million because it will be something similar. It may be different by a lot. It may be different by a little. So life is unpredictable, and risk management has all the tools to help us deal with that. Any other quick questions before I give you an example of how you integrate it into strategic planning? Yes, please.
Maybe just to be on the same page. Strategic planning, maybe you can define what you mean with it.
Sure. Well, for us, it was creating a 2020 strategic document, like a 2020 business plan that the government required all sovereign funds to have. So for us, that was strategic planning. It actually doesn't, like the actual algorithm of integration is pretty much similar for most business processes. Any other quick questions? All right. What does strategic plan look like? And what are the documents that usually combine into a strategic plan? What is it? It's a Word document with some text, but what else?
Vision.
Yeah, well, it's in the text bit. So there's a lot of fluff, but what else? And where do they come from? Yeah, and where do they come from? Where does would you agree that there are numbers in the strategic plan? There are some forecasts, some graphs, some projections, some targets, and where do they come from?
Baseline and some predictions.
Yeah, and what's the file where all of these predictions and forecasts are? There's an Excel file, yeah? So this is, it's not as funny as it sounds. Step number 1, find the Excel file. By the way, the strategic plan, and I mean, risk management is very pragmatic and very simple. Strategic plan is literally a Word document and an Excel that supports that Word document where all the numbers come from. So the Word document is really easy to find, but there's also an Excel file. So step number 1 in any risk management integration is find that Excel file, because risk management happens in Excel. It doesn't happen in Word, it doesn't happen in workshops, it doesn't happen in discussions. Risk management, risk analysis, I should say, happens in Excel. So finding that Excel is actually an exciting task. It took me 2 years to convince the CFO to give me open, uninterrupted access to that file because it has all the secrets. It is by far the most sensitive document in the organization. It has all the assumptions, it has all the projections, it has a lot of scary information. And unless your CFO comes from like some sort of consulting background, the file is probably going to be a mess. And he will be embarrassed or just angry about sharing it. So finding that Excel is step number 1. Now, what does that Excel look like? Has anyone seen it? So you are the problem. I'm kidding, of course. Yeah, exactly. So it's much easier if you already know where the document is. What does the strategic business plan that Excel looks like? What are the components of that Excel file? Yeah.
the loss and
So balance sheet, P&L, cash flow. That's like the outputs, and then there's of course the kind of the calculation. There's some sort of engine which kind of calculates all of that, the depreciations, the taxes, and the work. Like there's a lot of happening, but then the most important part from risk management point of view is that there are a lot of assumptions. What the foreign exchange going to be, what the inflation going to be, what the CPI increase going to be, what's the expected price of raw materials, of aluminium, or whatever else is relevant to your organization. So that's where a lot of assumptions are happening. And all of those assumptions are single point estimates, which is weird because, of course, foreign exchange and all the other macro and individual assumptions, they're all variable. They don't just stay consistent for the rest of the year. So what risk managers are doing is that they're looking at all of these assumptions. Well, actually, there's a step before that. Is once we found the Excel, it usually takes like a month to clean it. Because it may not be suitable for analyzing risks. We've had a huge case about solar generation, and we used risk analysis, by the way, to save solar generation industry in Russia, which was pretty exciting. Literally the next day after we've submitted our summary of our risk analysis, I saw in the news an article about the CEO of the company speaking to the deputy minister and then taking it to the ministry to change the tariffs in the legislation and change the solar generation legislation. That was pretty exciting. So cleaning the file usually takes a bit of time. And so for that solar generation project, it took us like a month to clean it and then 2 days to actually analyze risks. Because people don't really have in them the kind of the culture to share information, and they basically create it as their own working paper, which is not properly color-coded, not properly designed most of the time. Again, unless you're like lucky and somebody comes from a consulting experience where they have an etiquette, like a financial model and etiquette, it's probably going to be a mess. So then you have this file, this is the assumptions, and then step number 3, this is where you do your strategic risk identification, and you try and identify any additional strategic risk. And you're trying to match the two things to see whether all the risks are already accounted for in the model. They never are, so that means you'll have to make changes to the strategic model because some of the risks are not accounted for. You'll have to make changes to the actual Excel formulas. But then once you're happy that the assumptions and the model represents the kind of the general consensus on what the risks are, then you take all the assumptions and you replace single point estimates with potential distributions. So you give them ranges and you say, well, foreign exchange, what's the current foreign exchange to euro for krona? What's the exchange? What's the exchange rate right now? Euro. 10.45? Yeah, okay. It's like 75 rubles, so I've seen worse. So at the moment, what's your rate in the model at the moment? Because you don't budget for the current, like you still have some buffer, safety buffer. What's your approximate rate that you have in your model? 11, 12? Okay. But anyway, okay, so 10.4, and then we replace it with something that is relevant. I mean, this is the job of the risk manager, to come up with all of those ranges and use the external information. So once we replace all the assumptions with the distributions, we then do Monte Carlo simulation, which is basically running 5,000-10,000 scenarios to see how this uncertainty will impact on the strategic business plan. So once we do that, we actually have new balance sheet, new P&L, new cash flow, and sorry, I forgot, there's a lot of correlation. There's a lot of technical work risk managers have to take care of, and all the new metrics, KPIs, and all of the metrics that you have in the strategic plan, they stop being single values because you've replaced all the assumptions with ranges. So all your outcomes become ranges as well. And you have forecasted cash flow with different ranges. You have all your KPIs with different ranges. And that gives a lot more ammunition to the decision makers. So for example, the funniest thing I ever had was we've done the kind of the initial model of the strategic business plan. And so everybody was presenting the business plan. And then it was turned for the risk managers to speak. And so the CEO asked, so what's your kind of view on that? I said, the business plan is wonderful. There's about 99.999997% chance that we will not meet our strategic objectives. That means that there's 0.000003% chance that we will be successful. That basically means, if you didn't get it so far, that basically means the business plan is crap. It's just not going to fly. And in fact, it will have cash deficit in some of the years. So we went back to the drawing board, and the business changed assumptions, changed some of the strategic priorities, changed some of the strategic projects, and we ended up with a version where the chances of meeting strategic objectives set out by the government were 70%. So there was still 30% that we will not be successful in delivering the strategy. And the CEO said, I'm fine with that. Like, I can live with that. That's something I can take to the Ministry of Finance and Ministry of Economics, and I can kind of build a business case around that. So that's essentially how you integrate risk management into strategic planning. There's a lot more detail around it, but that's it in a nutshell. As you can see, that there's no likelihood and consequence discussion at all. There's no heat map at any stage, and this is a completely different tool set. So in the actual strategic planning policy or procedure or manual, that's when this process will kind of be will be discussed. There's no risk criteria per se. Risk management, when you start integrating into the actual decision making, is actually quite different to what we are used to seeing. So I think these are the kind of the key messages I wanted to share with you very briefly. I'm almost through my time. Thank you. Any questions? And by all means, do ask questions. Yes, please.
This works fine for currency, and this works fine for factor prices, where you have tradable commodities and so forth. But my experience is that many times executives are more worried about things like political risk.
Yeah.
And things that are not traded in organized exchanges.
Sure.
Where it's very difficult to make any assumption about distributions and probabilities.
Yep.
What advice would you give to them when it comes to such matters?
Yeah. I've been really simplifying it. It's actually applicable to literally any situation. There are instances where you don't have a continuous distribution. You have what they call like a binomial distribution, where or discrete distribution. You can model events as well. For example, the biggest event for us was, would we be able to refinance some of our loans? And there were basically two scenarios. Yes, we will be able to, or no, we won't be able to. And we've used the information we got from the finance department as well as from our banks to expertly allocate probability to each of those scenarios and highlight how significant that risk is. So technically speaking, you can model individual events just like you would with any what you call tradable securities. You can model any risk. There's a wonderful book by also Douglas Hubbard, which is called How to Quantify Anything. He argues that there's not a single risk on the planet that you can't quantify. By the way, I forgot to mention, not only you have this distribution as your result for all your key KPIs, you also have this diagram. What is it called? Who knows? What is it called? It's called Tornado diagram. And by the way, this is the heat map. This is the future of heat maps. You don't need a heat map because the simulation automatically shows you all the top 10, 20, 50 risks by how much they impact on whatever outcome or key metric that you are using. So it's actually the similar logic for investment projects. It's similar logic for budgeting, for construction projects. It's the kind of the tools. The tools are all the same. By the way, if this looks new or innovative to anyone, Monte Carlo was created in '46. Yeah, there's nothing new about it. This is what many industries have been using for decades. In fact, there's literally nothing new in risk management. I mean, we're kind of waiting for the artificial intelligence to kick in and do something amazing. IBM created Watson, and they give you access to their artificial intelligence engine for a small fee. And some friends of mine tried to plug in a lot of risk data into that artificial intelligence engine, but it didn't produce anything that wouldn't be obvious to a normal human anyway. So at the moment, artificial intelligence is not that amazing, but it will. For example, we already, in both English and Russian, we use artificial intelligence and chatbots to assess maturity. Like you can talk to your phone and answer 15 questions, and the computer will tell you how mature is risk management within your organization. By the way, also free. So we that's the next evolution of risk management, but this stuff has been around for decades. There's nothing new with it. Any other questions? Yes, please.
Now we're talking about financial risks, but what about quick technical changes? For example, that we used bulk slides for 100 years and all of a sudden it's gone and we use SVD lines instead.
Yeah. Well, and you do. The reason this simulation and this engine, this tool has been created is because when they were developing a nuclear bomb, they couldn't test how the bomb will explode, so they had to simulate. And they used highly complex, big computers with little huge disks in a big hangar. Well, now my tablet has enough computing power to model 10,000 scenarios in a couple of hours or maybe a couple of minutes, depending on how complex is your model. So this is what they've used in non-financial to begin with. Now, this is what they used to save Chilean miners. If you remember, many years ago, they had 30 people stuck underground for about a month, and they couldn't save them because they didn't know where to dig. Well, they've actually used Monte Carlo simulation to test different scenarios where they've modeled basically the soil substance, and they've tried to use different scenarios. Now, which is, by the way, a funny story. I had a new CFO in the company, and he wasn't convinced about using proper risk modeling tools. He was happy with his pessimistic, optimistic, realistic scenarios, which is, by the way, quite fun, because the pessimistic scenario that a CFO usually has, I'm sure you're different, but my CFO, the pessimistic scenario that my CFO had was, I think, twice as high as the optimistic scenario risk managers have. So this is just how big the disconnect is between using proper risk tools and not using proper risk tools. So yes, it's used in geo research by oil and gas. It's used by engineers in building new products, engines. It's heavily used by our engine makers in Russia. So the application of this tool is way beyond financial. It's basically trying to model anything.
Just a question there. As you said, the risk managers tend to be twice as negative as the CFO, who is by default the most positive person in the company.
Yeah.
If you relate him to the marketing department, for example,
Yes.
they're quite biased.
Sure.
But by the end of the day, you have to take a decision on what way to go.
You do?
In many cases, you're taking a lot of information.
Yep.
Then you have to take a decision and go for it.
No, absolutely.
That's not, in many cases, that's very much not data-driven, that decision.
It may be. It may be not. Yeah. Well, what I have discovered is that when the risk manager brings a lot of ammunition to the table and the decision makers have that information, then they go ahead. They may ignore that information that the risk manager brings. They may use it. It's it's a completely different, story.
I can comment that, but I mean we have the situation that we obviously have, as you said, we are producing these different scenarios, like that is the base scenario and positive and pessimistic. And what we did was we actually through the models we assigned likelihoods based on it, showing that actually the likelihood that we would reach even the pessimistic was quite high. So it actually made the strategy for the marketing department there to redo their scenarios to be more realistic. So
Mm-hmm.
it did have an impact. Taking in our models that we try to be as objective as possible.
Yeah, yeah.
But I mean, not saying ours are right, but at least
Yes. This does raise an important point because I'm obviously exaggerating a little bit when I said the pessimistic scenario of the CFO was better than the optimistic of the risk manager. It does often turns out that way, but mainly because the current kind of basic scenario analysis doesn't take all or even some of the risks into account. It's very, very high level. What this creates. Sorry, I had a point which I wanted to pick up on something good that you said, but I forgot. It will come to me. Any other question? Yes, please.
Just to follow up on that, isn't that actually a good thing? That these different opinions, different views, are just different spots on the same curve. Yeah. They're actually looking at the range, and you can actually take those point estimates and just plot them almost on a curve. So actually, it sort of addresses a couple of points here about political risk and technology as well. But you already can, and you have probably all of us use point estimates for those. If you look at different opinions, they're just different spots on the curve.
Yes, and thank you for what you've said. Reminded me what I had in mind. Is that I gave, like, when I was talking about all this stuff, you kind of probably got an impression that it's all negative and it's usually much worse than what the business is proposing. It usually is, just because business is so ignorant of risk. Our default human state, by the way, is not like risk averse or risk aggressive. Our default state is risk ignorant. Human brain is not designed for identifying, analyzing risk, and there's wonderful research around that by 2 Nobel Prize winners now in risk perception. Google risk perception, it's a page on Wikipedia which has a lot of research into cognitive biases on why humans don't understand the concept of risk. And unless you teach them specifically and unless you kind of prompt them, by the way, you know those likelihood consequence rankings that you get from people? Completely missing the point. Human brain is incapable of determining likelihood and consequences. Now, there's even special training that risk managers make people do to overcome overconfidence bias before having any kind of risk discussions. But basically, no matter what you do, there's still going to be lies. So you might as well just stick to like proper quantitative stuff. But what I wanted to say is that when you actually give all those distributions, assumptions, they're not negative. You actually look at all the range of scenarios. There's a lot of positive stuff as well, because I had 2 wonderful experiences. I was working for a sovereign fund in Russia, which was the business was overly optimistic. So they were always overcompensating. So any way we look at it, it was always worse. So we're like basically risk simulation is like shaking a business decision, and you're saying, does it still hold? If we shake it a little bit, is it still a good decision? And most decisions did not hold because they were originally bad decisions. And that was kind of discouraging because literally any budget we looked at, it always ended up the same. It was always much worse than what the business was promising. But when I went to a sovereign fund in the Middle East, it was a new company. They had a very different mentality. There wasn't really that kind of hiding and sinister motive. So what we did is when we did risk analysis, we actually confirmed that the decisions that the business was making were actually good. For example, they were bidding for a particular project like 100 million. And we would do our simulations and we would say that the price falls somewhere in the range between 80 and 120. So they were paying 100 million, which seemed like a fair price. They could have paid less, they could have paid more. So in some instances, when we applied risk modeling, I actually highlighted that this was a good decision. This was, opportunity taken by the business. And by the way, these tools solve so many problems. I know we're out of time, and I'll wrap up in a second. But these tools solve all the problems. You know how you have like this risk and opportunity and like positive and negative risk? Have you heard of that? Has anyone seen the risk matrix and then the opportunity matrix next to it? Has anyone seen that? That is literally the dumbest thing you can possibly do. Because all the proper tools and distributions, they show you the full range immediately. They show you all the positive scenarios and all the negative scenarios, and you can make a judgment whether this is a good or a bad decision based on the whole picture. You don't need separately to look at opportunities. You don't need to separately look at risks. Those tools were originally designed to show you the full range of possible outcomes. Thank you very much.